Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here today. It's a great pleasure to be at the Institute of Food Security, part of the Food Corporation of India. Let me start by just a very simple reflection. If you think back to the 1960s, and we had this meeting in the 1960s, we would be talking so much about the enormous task of meeting the hungry populations of India and feeding the hungry populations of India, and whether we could even imagine being food self-sufficient. Today we are in this very fortunate situation of saying India is a food self-sufficient country, and to a large extent this problem of hunger has been addressed. Obviously there's still a lot of hungry people, but hunger because there's not enough food in the country is no longer an issue. And I believe the enormous contributions that were made through the Green Revolution, the investments in science and technology, R&D, the infrastructure investments, and the enormous job that the Food Corporation of India has done in procuring and moving food grains from areas of production into areas where it's needed by the poor, contributed enormously to the success that we've seen in addressing the problem of hunger. Now, as the Economic Survey of India, which just came out 2 days ago as part of the budget, says, we've solved the problem of hunger. The Green Revolution addressed a major problem of hunger, but we are victims to our own success. That's the exact quote from the Economic Survey. We are a victim to our success because we've not been able to move from the paradigm of food grain self-sufficiency to looking to a broader paradigm of diversification of the food system of India and looking at ways in which one can improve the nutritive value of the food system. So that's essentially what I'd like to talk about today. If you look at where we are in terms of a food system in India, I think we are facing an enormous set of new challenges which are quite different from the challenges we faced in the 1960s. The challenge today is a very rapid increase in demand for diet diversity. And then how do we address the persistent problem of malnutrition in the country through food systems that have better nutritive values, better nutrition outcomes that come from the food system? And most importantly, how do you make a more nutritious food more affordable to poor populations? Poor populations having better access and better affordability of nutritious food. And the last area, I think, where there's a big challenge, and Dr. Sharon has talked about that also, is how do you look at the existing safety net programs, the PDS, the ICDS, etc., and how do you improve the nutrition sensitivity of these programs? So these are some of the big challenges that we are facing today as we look at Indian food system and the long-term prospects for food security and nutrition security. So let me go very quickly through some of these issues. Poverty. I mean, no matter which metrics you use, we've seen a big drop in overall numbers of poor. Whether you go from the older metrics that were used or the more recent Tendulkar metrics, we're beginning to see that there's steady progress in poverty reduction taking place. And as a consequence, a fairly large growth in middle-class populations around the country. When you look at state-wise reductions in poverty, I'm sorry, you can't see this very well, But if you go up to Karnataka, and if you use the MDG criteria of reducing by 50% the number of poor relative to 1990, then you can say that 2/3 of the states in India have actually met the MDG goal of poverty reduction. While the narrative on India is we have not met the goal of poverty reduction, the reality is that 2/3 of the country have made significant progress in poverty reduction. And of course, you still have the so-called Bimaru states that continue to be having higher levels of poverty. But even in those states, the rate of decline in poverty over the last decade or 2 decades has been quite significant. Now, one of the consequences for food as you do that, as you reduce poverty, is you begin to see an increased demand for food. But not just an increased demand for food grains, but an increased demand for diversity of food. And if you look at the data, and here the data that I'm showing you shows you average consumption within the country, which looks at total amount of food in the country divided by total population, corrected for exports and net imports, etc. And what you see over time is that total calorie consumption has gone up more than twice, 2.5 times. And what you see is per capita consumption of staple grains has risen, but you're also beginning to see an increased amount of consumption of non-staples. You're beginning to see increased consumption of a variety of other food groups. Certainly fruits, vegetables, pulses, vegetable fats, vegetable oils, sugars, sweeteners, etc. So there's the number of food groups consumed and the quantity of food groups consumed is increasing steadily over time as incomes are rising. But the main component of the Indian diet still seems to be concentrated in the main staples, rice and wheat. So even today, more than 60 to 70% of the total calories that come in an Indian diet are still coming from the 2 big staples, rice and wheat. Even as we see this move towards diversification going on. So the challenge as you look forward is to say, how do you reduce the share of the staples relative to the other food groups in the diet? So how do you make the diet even more diversified as you look to the future? Now, it's very hard to get good data on per capita consumption of diverse food. Much of the Indian household survey data, the National Sample Survey data, is based on recall. And because it's based on recall, 30-day recall, etc., it's very hard to actually document the trends that are taking place in diet diversity. But the easier way in which you can track diet diversity is to see what's happening to per capita consumption of staples. Because as your diets are diversifying, your per capita consumption of staples begins to drop. And here the report that comes from the National Sample Survey shows that if you look across all income groups, except for the lowest income group within the country, in all other income groups, over this time period between 1993 to 2005, there's been a significant drop in per capita consumption of rice and wheat across all income groups except the poorest income group. Now, this is interesting because this is the same trend that you see across Southeast Asia. It's the same trend that you see in East Asia. And if you look historically, that was the same trend that happened in Europe and in the US, etc. As incomes have risen, per capita consumption of the main staple began to drop, and the diversification of diets has happened. So in this context, India is following the same trend that all other countries that are going through the development process are going. So this drop in per capita consumption of cereals doesn't mean that people are eating less. It actually means people are eating more, but a more diverse diet. And I think some of the narrative in the press hasn't figured this out clearly enough. So, but even as we talk about income growth, we still face a fairly significant issue around malnutrition. And the data on that is very clear. The most recent rapid survey of children shows that even states which are progressing still have very high levels of child stunting and still have very high levels of underweight children under 5 years of age. But look at where the real concentration is. The real concentration of stunting is again back in the central and eastern parts of India. And that seems to be the case, while the other parts of India seem to be showing reductions in overall child stunting, reductions in underweight. They still are stubbornly high in the poorer regions of the country, and that's where I think one needs to focus a lot more. But something else very interesting is happening. And I apologize you can't see this graph well. But here on the x-axis, I have the percentage of undernourished children. And here on the y-axis, I have the percentage of overweight adults. And then each of these dots represents a state. So as you'd expect, the poorer states of India, Bihar, Jharkhand, etc., still have very high levels of malnourished children, stunted children, underweight children, etc., and very low levels of overweight adults. But as you come to the more progressive states, the higher income states like Punjab, Kerala, Delhi, of course, the city of Delhi, Goa, Tamil Nadu, etc., you begin to see that the proportion of overweight adults dominates underweight children, malnourished and stunted children. And so the problem of malnutrition is slowly transitioning from a problem of undernourishment to a problem of overnourishment. And that's visually happening as states' incomes are rising, as they're becoming more urbanized, etc. Now here's a really interesting set of figures. Again, these are all the states. And here what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say this is the percentage of households that have both an undernourished family member and an overweight family member. So within the same household, you have both spectrums of the malnutrition problem, undernutrition and overnutrition. And it's really interesting because as you look at the states that have progressed a lot, Andhra, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, etc., all of these states, you find that the percentage of households which face the dual burden of undernourishment and overnourishment starts to rise very much. Whereas if you look at the underperforming states like Bihar, that percentage is very small. So even within a family, you're beginning to see this transition of the malnutrition problem. You're beginning to see the burden of malnutrition going from just being an undernourishment problem to a problem of undernourishment and overnourishment happening. So it's a new food security challenge that we need to be thinking about much more seriously. So in my view, The solution to undernourishment, malnourishment due to not having enough adequate amounts of nutritious food, and the solution to overnourishment is the same. The solution is improved access to micronutrient-rich food. The more affordable and the better the access of micronutrient-rich vegetables, fruit, livestock products, etc., then you're able to address both of these problems simultaneously. The executive director was telling us earlier about the relationship between white rice consumption and diabetes. So the more you can reduce white rice consumption, the more one can substitute that with micronutrient-rich vegetables, the less you begin to see that relationship happening. But today you see that very close link with the increased dependence on staples and other overweight issues that are coming up. But it's not just staples. The access to cheap calories through oils, through fats, through sugars, etc., are part of the problem that we see. So the big challenge is, how do we make nutritious food more affordable to the poor? How do you improve the supply and reduce the prices of more nutritious food? So let's look at the food system today. If you look at the food system, this graphs show you essentially where the total calories in the food system are coming from. And even today, looking over the last several decades, you find that over 80%, at least 70% of the total calories consumed are coming from cereals, coming from the main cereals, rice and wheat. And it's only about 30% of the total calories consumed that are coming from other sources, from non-cereal sources. And again, if you think, and this is a story we all know, where is this calories, which types of food is it coming from? And we are still very much a vegetarian society. And so more than 90% of the overall food consumed is still vegetarian food. And it's still calorie-based vegetarian food, cereal-based vegetarian food that's being consumed. And although there's been some improvement in livestock product consumption, meat consumption, it's still very small. It's still less than 10% of the overall diet. And we're talking averages here. We're not talking about diets of different income levels of the population. So a big challenge in terms of, as you think about diversification, how do you shift these figures around from cereal-based to increase non-cereal-based, and to bringing in more livestock products into the food system? So those are some of the challenges. But let's look at what the food system in India looks like. And here is some maps that show you what some of the big historical changes in the food system that we've seen. Here's a map from 1960s. 1960s shows you that this is pre-Green Revolution. Pre-Green Revolution, there was rice and wheat production going on across the country, and maize production. But as the Green Revolution progressed, see how this whole area, which is famously called the Indo-Gangetic Plains, basically became the concentrated focus area for rice and wheat production. That's where the big gains from the Green Revolution came from. And there were some gains out in the southern parts of the country, some of the seaboard areas on the east and west coast. But the central part of the country did not see much of the gains. The big gains of the Green Revolution was in that Indo-Gangetic Plain. And that's what led to India becoming self-sufficient in food grains. But it also resulted in reducing the amount of diversity in production systems over this period of time. So if you look At that same area, the Indo-Gangetic Plain area, that area had a lot more pulse production in the 60s. It had a lot more diversity in production systems. And that diversity got pushed down during the Green Revolution period. So if you look at this brownish region, that brownish region has very, very low diversity. And that was essentially the rice wheat systems that came in. And whereas the central part of the country started to see more diversity happening. The central part of the country saw diversity in terms of oilseed production and cotton production, soybean production, sugarcane production started to come in, and coarse grain cereal production started to move down from the Indo-Gangetic Plains into Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, etc. So you began to see different patterns in diversification taking place, but unfortunately, the more nutritious crops, such as the traditional millets, pulses, etc., got moved into areas of lower productivity. These crops were of low productivity to start with, but they got moved into areas of lower productivity, lower rainfall, drought-prone areas, poor soil condition areas, etc. So their overall productivity continued to be very low and stagnant, and as population density started to rise, their ability to meet the demand for these products began to suffer, and hence you begin to see this increased imports of pulses, etc., that are happening in the country. Look at the pulse story. The pulse story is very clear. Between 1960s to 2000, the total area under pulses in the country dropped by 650,000 hectares. Okay? And the drop happened primarily in this Indo-Gangetic Plain. And the pulse production moved a little bit south. Not much, but it moved basically into Madhya Pradesh, somewhat into Gujarat, etc. And that's where I think one needs to look at pulse production in the future and say, can we bring some of the pulse production back into the higher productivity Indo-Gangetic Plains area and other more productive areas? And I know P.K. Joshi is going to talk about this later today. Fruits and vegetables, that's another story. In this time period between the 60s and 2000, we've actually seen a 5 million hectare increase in fruits and vegetables. Okay, so that's in a way good news, but it's not great news because even then the overall productivity of fruits and vegetables has been low, and the overall rate of growth and supply of fruits and vegetables haven't kept up with the rate of growth and demand. So prices of these products have been rising over time as population and income has been rising. The big good news story in India is what's happened to milk. So here is a graph which shows you the number of female cows and buffaloes to male of that species in 1960s. And you see that in the 1960s, most of the cattle population in the country was male population. And the reason for that was most of it was used for draft power, very little for milk. But if you look in the 2000s, you suddenly see that the area under purple started to take off. And you see in places like Punjab, there are more than 20 cows for every bull and 20 male buffaloes for every female buffalo, more than 20. So that indicates this growing supply of milk and milk-based products that's coming out of these areas, and similarly in the south, etc. But where you don't see the change is again in these lagging regions of the country. The lagging regions of the country continue to be dependent on animal power, continue to have very low levels of supply of dairy-based products, etc. So that's a challenge one needs to look at. But this phenomenal growth in the dairy industry over the last 3 decades or 4 decades is quite a big story And I think we can learn a lot of lessons from that story as we think about vegetable production, fruit production, etc. in the country. So the puzzle always in India is you have this big demand for non-staple cereal products, but the supply tends to be limited and prices tend to be high. And why aren't farmers responding to the higher prices? Now, one of the reasons people say farmers don't respond is because most of the farmers in the country are smallholder farmers. So here's a graph that shows you that by 2011, the agriculture census of 2011 shows that about 80% of the farms in India are under 2 hectares. So we're talking about very small farm communities that are trying to make this transformation happen, which is quite unique for India compared to some of the other countries that are going through this transformation process. But these small farms were the ones that created the Green Revolution. So it's not as if small farmers cannot make the transition. It is what's the mechanisms for making that happen. And one of the reasons why there's been such low response in terms of switching from staples is there's definitely been a policy bias towards staple grains. There's been a policy bias which continues since the Green Revolution of providing support and either through inputs, technical support, infrastructure support, everything targeted towards the main staples. That was the right policy at the right time, but now one needs to say, how do we get beyond that policy? At the same time, infrastructure investments for non-staples, especially perishable products, have been limited. And also moving from staple grains to non-staples requires different skills, different knowledge systems, etc. And the extension around this has been very weak. And finally, the transactions costs of farmers selling their products in the market is much higher when you look at perishable products, vegetables, fruit, livestock products, etc., relative to staples. And that's something that needs to be addressed. So one of the things that I continue to advocate for is to think about a crop-neutral agriculture policy. In the past, agriculture policy was focused on staple grains, but now one needs to think about an agriculture policy that can promote overall agriculture productivity, put the elements together for increasing productivity, such as irrigation infrastructure, roads, transport infrastructure, a level policy playing field, etc., but not tie the policy to particular commodities. So if you do it that way, then you're eventually going to get to a system where farmers respond to markets. So farmers then begin to say, markets for vegetables are much higher price-wise relative to others, and so slowly start moving in that direction. So eventually you begin to see a more diversified production system. Now, this sounds very simple, and operationally it's not that easy to do. And I realize that operationally it's not that easy to do, but that's the paradigm I think one needs to start moving towards if you want to get to a more diversified food system. Then coming to the safety net programs. I think there's a lot that's happened on the safety net programs, and we've heard a lot about many of the reforms that are happening in the safety net programs and the reforms as we come to the NFSA, implementation of the NFSA, etc. But I think the safety net program, especially the PDS program, the MS, the midday meal scheme, etc., are still very much cereal-based programs. So the challenge, I think, is how do you get beyond that? And I think the recognition that one needs to go beyond cereals is very clear. We heard that already this morning. The question is, how do we do it? What are the programs and policies that will allow you to get more pulses into the system? that gets you more dairy products into the system, etc. The National Food Security Act, you've heard a lot about that already. But I think as you think about the National Food Security Act, we need to think about the fact that it still is very focused on staple cereals. And can we get beyond that to looking more at the role of pulses and coarse grain cereals, etc., and look at how one can expand the procurement systems in order to make that happen. It's not easy. And again, P.K. Joshi is going to talk about some of the procurement challenges when you go from staple systems to pulses, etc. He's looking very puzzled at me, but I hope that's what he's going to talk about. And then I think it's important to say, do farmers have the incentives to make the transition? Farmers up to now have been, they're part of the procurement system. The incentives are to continue working on getting more rice and wheat into the procurement system. How do you create a new incentive systems for crops that don't have the same level of productivity, and the price ratios may not give them the profitability that they need in order to make the transition? So I think we need to think about a food and agriculture policy and redesign a food and agriculture policy, thinking about the needs of the food systems of the future. And the way one would think about that is the policy needs to move towards an emphasis on diversification, towards more nutritious crops and more livestock products. And I think we need to focus a lot more attention on Eastern India. Imagine the amount of investments that were made in the Green Revolution. I don't think we are making that level of investments in Eastern Indian agriculture system. While we keep talking about improving Eastern Indian agriculture, we haven't made those investments, and that's necessary. But to do it in a crop neutral policy way. And so investing in roads and transport, in cold storage systems, etc., irrigation systems, and let the crops themselves come out of market signals rather than promoting particular crops in these systems. We need to do a lot more in terms of connecting smallholders to value chains, especially for horticulture products and livestock products. And we need to look at the ground level at convergence across various programs in terms of nutritional goals, the ICDS, the PDS, and the midday meal schemes, along with other health programs, water sanitation programs, etc., coming together with clear goals on how do we address nutrition security as we move beyond hunger security. And we heard today about the challenge of moving from an in-kind food-based program to a cash transfer scheme. And I think it'll be interesting to see how this evolves over time, because as one gets to a cash transfer scheme instead of an in-kind food program, then the opportunities for diversification become higher, because then individuals choose what they want to buy, and depending on market infrastructure that's available, one may see diet diversification being pushed in that area. So let me stop there. If you want to know more about our program, the Tata Cornell program, you can visit us on our website, and you can visit our blogs, and you can also follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much.